Hey, this is Pastor Tim Delaney coming to you live once more. Well, actually, I shouldn't say live, as we're preparing for this time of looking at the book of Judges. As you may have saw from our little cover picture that we had before, we're looking at the book of Judges. And honestly, I would say this is probably one of our more controversial books of the Bible, mostly because so much of what we see in this book is violence and war. We see people killing in the name of God. We see this kind of behavior that very much contradicts what we eventually will see with Jesus as it comes to how violence is upheld and done. And more often than not, this is oftentimes where we also see a lot of our justification for violence and death and killing in the name of God that, of course, paints dark histories like during the medieval times, the Dark Ages, where we see near the Reformation, what we see as the Crusades, and we see this as one of those things even with in our own area or in our own country, the United States, where we see the I was gonna say Magna Carta, but no, it's not the Magna Carta, but Manifest Destiny, where it was God's ordained call to take this land, to go and expand on this stuff, and that means any means necessary. But yet, what we're going to see and what we're going to go over with the book of Judges is that while there is a great deal of violence that happens in here, that there's a greater lesson to gain and learn from this that is very anti-violence in this case. So we're going to go ahead and get started into this right away then. So as we look into our beginning parts of the overview of this book, especially with what we look at was the main story of what we can look at with Judges is according to Jewish tradition, the prophet Samuel is traditionally accredited for writing the book of Judges in the 11th century BCE. And so what we see is that this book is anonymous for the most part. We don't know for sure. We're not 100% sure, but even there's the chance that some more modern scholars will even look that there are later editors, that this may have actually been something that has come out during a later time, with even during the time of King David, but we don't know for that for sure. So when we kind of look at the setup with this, if we look at that first aspect of Samuel the prophet, I mean, if we look at what is called the Talmudic tradition, so the Talmud, which is one of the big commentaries or important writings that go along with the Tanakh, remember this Jewish scripture here, that we're looking at this some are that identifies Samuel as the author. This is supported by the context of the book, which likely finalized shortly after the establishment of the monarchy, because during one of the fascinating things during the monarchy is that we will see a great deal of scholarship that really takes off and takes on during this time, as we see especially with King David, who was very important about trying to get that stuff done. Of course, then the phrase no king, that ties into Judges chapter 17 verse 6, where it says that in those days there was no king in Israel. And so it suggests that the author may not have been so much Samuel himself, but the authorship was actually done during the time of Judges, during that expansion there, but was then later interpreted and put together by a later source, either Saul or David, which of course we probably lean more towards David on this, but yet we don't know for sure. And then of course, as our next source says, is that the possibility of authorship is a compiled sources, which this very much plays into what we talked about with our first five of the books of the Bible, where it wasn't just one authorship, but this was something that was compiled together. Because if we were to look at the grand scheme and map of things, I mean, the Judges spanned it a great deal of time, because some of them, as we'll soon learn, they ruled as the judge for 20, 30 some years, so that means that they're not all going to be alive during the exact same time of things. So we see a larger session of things here. Um, then, of course, one of the alternative views is that to suggest that, as we saw with our earlier books of the Bible, that this was actually not edited or really put together until the Babylonian exile. So we're actually saying this is close, that the work was much later, but the problem with that is that because of other scholarship, especially the Talmud and others, that scholarship is seen more as the authorship was probably closer to the monarchy in this case. So not something that was after the exile, not something that happened during, but something that happened more at the closeness of Judges, but in during the time of the monarchs themselves. And so one of the things that this plays very much into is what the historical play or the historical account of Israel's transition from the death of Joshua into the rise of the monarchies, because they didn't just have a king right off the bat. In fact, that's what we see with the Judges here, because we will find that as the people realized that, hey, all the other people around us, they have kings, and we have no leadership, godly leadership, like they did with Moses or with Joshua, and so there's a demand in this. And so one of the answers to this was certain individuals rising up as judges. They weren't monarchs, they weren't kings and queens, they weren't royalty in this case, but yet they were leadership in different ways here. And oftentimes, as we're going to learn, that this leadership did not necessarily mean spiritual leadership. Some will find that some of them were actually warriors. And so we would see this. In fact, Deborah, who is the only female that we're going to read more, she was a prophetess. And so we're saying that we're going to have much more that goes on with all this stuff coming up. So after we kind of take a look at the idea of what our genre of these things look like, we then can look at our, not genres, but the authorship, but our genres. Because the book of Judges covers a good variety of different things in here. At the very most of all of this, Judges is seen as a narrative history within what's called, in that first part up there at the top. So we're looking at this one, our Deuteronomistic history. And honestly, I probably should have talked about that a little bit more during Joshua and even Deuteronomy, because what that Deuteronomistic history is a modern scholarly theory that proposes that the book starting with Deuteronomy to Joshua to Judges to Samuel and Kings actually formed a single cohesive theological history of Israel. Like, these ones play out in such a way that they are more of a historical narrative, that we see more of what that growth is. Because unlike Leviticus and Numbers, where we see a greater depth of what is the rules of things, Deuteronomy plays more of a narrative that follows into Joshua, that then follows into Judges, and as we see eventually with Samuel and these other ones, it plays more into this historical narrative of things. And one of the big things that this entails is that this idea stems from German scholar Martin Noth, in 1943, that defines that these former prophets. So he's identifying Joshua through Kings, so we're looking at these former prophets. Because then we, of course, have our later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then we have our minor prophets that fall after that. These are like the former, like these are your original prophets. And so what we'd see play out through that part plays into that Deuteronomistic history of what it plays out then. But that's not the only thing that sees as some of our key genres into this. We also have heroic tales and folk tales. And I mean, this consists mainly of what we see as our Judges. I mean, that's one of the things that we're not going to get into the in-depth of of all 12 Judges, but we're going to be looking at an overall synopsis of what were their major things, what was their major contributions to what Israel needed in those times. And so what we're going to see is we're going to look at these military leaders, these champions, everything from Ehud to Gideon to Samson, who are some of the more famous or well-known ones. And so, unfortunately, what we're going to see is, as this plays out, heroic tales, folk tales. What's that going to mean? Well, you're going to have a climax in these stories, and they're going to be very heroic. Think a lot of like Hercules, or actually, if we're going to go Greek on this, Heracles is the proper name. Achilles, Jason, they're very dramatic. Homer, I mean, what we see in these stories is that they follow this thing where some huge dramatic climax happens, and there's oftentimes violence, and that there's some type of dramatic moment that happens. And let me tell you this, if we're going to pick a drama queen out of the entire Bible, Judges, in my opinion, will definitely fill that one. So, especially with what we're going to do, especially as we look a little bit more at the Judges themselves. But then, of course, let's move on, because we're going to get to that eventually. So another aspect of what this historical aspect of what that Judges offers us is a theological history. And what this does is it bridges a gap between between Joshua, in which that's the age of the conquest, and takes us all the way to the monarchies, which is one of the more famous aspects of this, because it's through the kings that we see this civil disobedience that rises up, that even those chosen by God are flawed. In fact, that's actually the big story of what is so important of our overarching theme of Judges, is the flawness in humanity. But we'll get to that soon. So the next one then is the cylindrical pattern. And what we mean by cylindrical is cylindrical, circle, and it keeps going. There's no end to these. Because the narrative of what we see so often happen in the book of Judges is it goes downhill. It's a downward spiral. Because we see it at least 7 times of the people sinning, falling into oppression, crying out to God for help, and then God delivers them. And so we see that a lot. Remember, I said 7 times in this book alone. And so we're going to see that a little bit of where the judges play a major factor into solving these issues. And then, of course, the last one is poetry, in which the most notable source of poetry in this, and I highly recommend you going to check it out, is chapter 5, which is also known as the Song of Deborah. Remember, she's our only female judge, but yet what she does and what she calls and does in this poetic song is amazing in of itself. So, what we see overall in these genres is that they all carry a very central point to this, and that is a warning against spiritual apathy, showing that the absence of godly kings, and that everyone did, as we see it, we're going to hear a lot, everyone did what was good in their own eye. And as we know, what one person sees as good is not necessarily good to another person, and what's bad is, it's very convoluted, and it's why we have the saying, the eye of the beholder. What's good is in the eye of the beholder. So that's going to sit there and bring us up into our next important aspect of when we're looking at the themes. So we're looking at some of the main themes that we see in the book of Judges that highlights Israel's spiritual, moral, and political decline through a cycle of disobedience, oppression, repentance, deliverance. And we're going to see that a lot as we go through all this stuff too. That's actually going to be a very repetitive theme throughout this entire session as we look at the book of Judges, because its core purpose is to show God's faithfulness in providing temporary leadership and saving Israel from their own unfaithfulness. It's the whole save you from yourselves thing. And so what we see in this, of course, is that we looked at this cycle of sin and deliverance. So Israel rebels, conquered, cries help. It's an endless cycle that we see through this. The moral and spiritual decay, a breakdown of the covenant law. And one of the things I find interesting is that the commonly word used for this is, remember, this is the land of Canaan. Canaanization, adopting foreign idolatrous practices. So falling into the ways of the people of the land that are living there. But something we have to remember is that they've always been living there. It's not just some random new group of people. These are people that were living there during the time of Isaiah, Isaac, during the time of Abraham, his cousin. They've been around for a long time. So, of course, one of the major themes is everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it concludes by highlighting the chaotic results of abandoning God for personal and moral relativism. Our next one is that God's faithfulness and grace. That's one of the things that we're going to see that's very big throughout this, is that despite Israel's repeated failure, God is always there to protect them, to save them. In fact, that might be, I would not be surprised if this is one of the reasons why we see Israel fail 7 times and get resaved. It's kind of reflective of what Jesus will one day say when we get to that point, where they come to him, it's like, how often should I forgive my brother or my sister? And Jesus says 7 or 77 times 7. He's giving some outrageous big number, saying that you should not keep count of this. You should always be doing the right thing on this. So then, of course, that leads into our flawed leadership, because you would think that these judges, these people that God picked, would be righteous and great, that do wonderful, amazing things. But guess what? They are flawed just like you and me. They're flawed no differently than the disciples who was Jesus' inner circle. They're flawed just like the patriarchs that we see in Genesis that we talked about. I mean, it seems like every human that gets chosen in this has some type of major flaw, some type of issue that's going on. But yet that is where we see that God shines the greatest. It shows that while it's impossible and not working for us, it's not impossible or working for God. And so with that, we then look at kind of our overall purpose of what this book is. It's about deliverance. And so the primary role of the judges is to serve as military, political, religious leaders to save Israel from foreign oppression. Is to show the need for a king. The text highlights that that when there's a lack of godly presence into this, it just falls into utter turmoil. It's all over the place. It's just a bushfire of things. And so what we see is that this then prepares for the next book of Samuel, when we see the introduction of a monarchy setup. Of course, we see it maintains as a historical following from the time of Joshua to the monarchy. We see how that transition goes over with the possession of the land. And then, of course, that final one is that it is a cautionary tale. It acts as a warning against us that even as those with the best intentions, I mean, it's going to fall apart. In fact, as C.S. Lewis would say in his book, Paved with Good Intentions, a demon's roadmap to your soul. It's a follow-up to the Screwtape Letters, but yet, once more, it is one of those things that alludes to us that even with our best intentions, even if we're saying that, well, I didn't mean to do that, well, it doesn't matter. It still happened. We still have to think through this greater aspect of things. And so that then leads us into like the context of the book, because one of the things that's so important to understand of what's going on in that world, especially once we get to the later part of this lesson when we talk about what is the application for today, we have to understand the context of what's going on there in that time. As we look at this as a historical context of the book of Judges, it covers a period of between Joshua's death and the rise of the monarchy, and we're looking at roughly 1350 BC to 1050 BC. So we're looking at around 300 years here. And we see this lack of a centralized government. We see a transition of dark violence, an era where independent Israelite tribes were settling in Canaan, and I mean they're combating the other tribes and people around them at the same time. And so to understand the context of what's going on here, we have these four major contextual points here. First is a dark age of leadership. Judges were not legal judges, but rather regional military chieftains, charismatic leaders raised up by God to deliver tribes in crisis. So we have to understand, they don't hold the same position as Joshua or Moses once did. They don't have the same role that the kings that would come are going to be. They're holding a whole different aspect of things. But because we're looking at this very tribalistic aspect of things, it is not the most organized set. And then once more we see that cylindrical pattern. The narrative constantly repeats itself. It looks like things are good, and then doom. Hey, look, God saved us. Ooh, great. God saved us. Ooh, yeah. Not boding well on this case. And so we see that constant throughout it. And I even told you, this is a theme, a focus that we're going to see throughout this whole lesson aspect. And then, of course, the political disarray. There's no king. There's no centralized leadership. There's no governing body that can help organize or keep things going in good places. And so it's just civil disobedience, civil conflict. I mean, pure and unadulterated anarchy. And I don't mean anarchy in the way of overthrowing a government that is unruly or that is harming the people, but I mean anarchy in the way that it is dog eat dog world here. No one, everyone's looking out for number one. There's very little that's actually going on and helping your neighbor in this case. To which then this gives us kind of an understanding of what the geopolitical context. And so what we see through this is that this is during the late Bronze Age collapse with threats from the Philistines. And this is also a time that we're starting to see an Egyptian control. Egypt was one of the major powers in this, but yet we're starting to see that they are waning in all of this. And so, of course, this leads us into the understanding that this is roughly a 300-year gap between Joshua and the prophet Samuel, who would then anoint King Saul, who would be the first monarch of the time. So we're seeing a lot on that part there. So what we're seeing now is what our summary for the overall thing would be, that the book of Judges explores humanity's tendency to trust themselves over God and do what is right in their own eyes. This habit highlights humanity's need for God's grace and a future king who will rescue the people from their self-centeredness. What we're seeing is a great deal of that you need to trust in God into all of this. So what that then leads us into is what is the sections then. Judges is a 21 chapter book in which it breaks down into three major setups. We have what is known as the double introduction, in which we see that introduction and describes the incomplete conquest of Canaan. Because you would think with Joshua and with everything going on that they accomplished it. Everything was great. Wrong. The conquest never truly gets to the point that that Joshua and probably Moses had envisioned for all this. In fact, it's not what God has probably envisioned because the people can't get along. There's political failing, there's religious failing, there's a spiritual decline in everything that's going on. And so we're seeing this complete and utter falling apart of things. And it doesn't look good for them at all. And we see that chapter 1 verse 1 all the way up through chapter 3 verse 6. But it's in that point then that we see that's transition into what is the stories of Judges. And we're not going to get into the main part of that because mostly the significance of the Judges' stories we're going to get to when we look at when we look at the character analysis of what's going on with these. And so, of course, we're going to be looking at the quality of leadership. But see, here's the unfortunate thing too, is that spiral that we've talked about, that cylindrical spiral downwards. We can, even within the Judges itself, that we see this happen, where we had the first few judges were great, and then over time those judges just did not go well. And of course, the last judge, Samson, well, he was raised in the ways of God. He's a Nazarite, but yet he was so egotistical. But we'll get to that as we get closer to that part there, because then of course the last part, which is chapter 17 through chapter 21, we see our concluding supplement, in which we see two stories, the idol of Micah and the Levite's concubine, illustrating the extreme religious and moral depravity of the era. And so that's one of the, what let's be honest, this was not really a book I was really looking forward to doing, but as we understand that in order to get the bigger picture of things, we can't just ignore the bad. We have to embrace both the bad and the good. It's the story of the two wolves within us. That's the old Cherokee story, where one represents all that is good, one represents all that is bad, and it's not about which one that you feed. It's about finding balance between the two, because the bad is not necessarily bad, but something that can help us gain and learn and go from. And so the whole ending concubine story is a very big tragedy, in which we will get to that one after a bit then. But when we look at the overall narrative flow of things, I mean, there's no better way of doing that downward spiral. And like I said, that happens 7 times. I mean, there are 7 times that we see sin fall into oppression that leads to servitude to someone else with supplication, salvation, and then silence and peace. I mean, it literally goes on 7 times within 21. Well, wait a minute. No, we can't say that because, as we know, the stories of the judges goes from chapter 3 to chapter 16. So, honestly, in 13 chapters, we see this fall 7 times. But we can't sit there and just be discredited toward them because that's something that we still see to this day. The narrative moves from the success of early leaders like Othniel to the increasing narcissism and instability of later leaders, ending in complete internal chaos. So that's what we're going to be really looking at as we go about this stuff. Because now as we look at that thematic approach to things, I mean, the book of Judges represents a thematic approach on a downward spiral of moral and spiritual decay. It is by that continual cycle going down, in which the pattern is generally located in this. You see that cycle of disobedience delivery? I mean, it generally falls into this setup. Part 1, sin, or Israel sins, in which the common one of this time is, remember that canonization, in which we see the idolatry. That's the big one, is picking other gods before God, going to the idols, going into this stuff, which was a common practice in those days, especially when it came to like blood sacrifices, when it came to different ritualistic things. And so we see this big changing set of go with all of this then. But of course then God allows oppression, Israel cries out, God raises a judge for rescue, and then the cycle repeats. But we see that moment of peace and stability for a brief while, as long as that judge is in control or leadership. Then of course that downward spiral, we've been keeping that up, so I'm not going to really hit on that one again because that's one that is a constant throughout this. Then there's that need for true leadership. It highlights the mess when everyone did what was right in their own eye, emphasizing the need for a king, because eventually it gets to the point where the people are like, well, we can't seem to be able to do this by ourselves, so we need some type of leadership. And yet, for some reason, that leadership never dawned on them to go to God on this. So we're seeing this awkward setup of all this. To which then we see this, despite the human failure, God's sovereignty and patience plays out every single time. God just kind of like, okay, maybe they'll learn this time. It's like the lesson of like, ooh, it's hot. Ooh, it's hot. Okay, maybe this time it won't happen. Nope, it's hot. God is very patient, hoping that we will eventually learn. By grabbing that hot iron, we will learn. A few thousand years later, we haven't yet, though. Well, there's always hope for us. So, God is patient. So what we see then further with this is then we see this narrative climax. The book is structured to show decline, with stories of Samson, Micah, and the Levite's concubine illustrating the depth. I mean, most stories start like this. Then they start to build a climax, start to build things up, and then it drops. Because everything's better, yay! Not the book of Judges. The book of Judges does not do this. In fact, the book of Judges starts somewhat on a high note and just plummets then. And it's something that is important for us to gain and listen and learn from all of this. Because now as we look at the Judges, unfortunately, I should have checked to make sure I did these in order, actually. I don't remember if I did these in order, but the focus was just to try to have the 12 judges out there so we could talk, because we approximate that the time span of the judges, the era of the judges, was about 300 years. And it's during that time that we see at least 12, if not a few more, leaders God has risen in this cycle of rebellion. And of course, one of the first ones we do know this for absolute certain, is that Othniel is the first judge of Israel. The people, of course, had fallen from God. They had fallen into idolatry, so they fell into the oppression of King Cushan Resithium. And it's during this oppression that the people are finding such difficult times that they call out to God. And the first judge to come forward is Othniel. And it's through him that God conquers the people, defeats the king Cushan Resithium, and in doing so, the people of Israel are so elated in this judge helping them in this case that they gave him his wife, Aksha. And it's through this that we see a great deal of prosperity for a time being. But because one of the other judges that comes along the way was Ehud. And he is literally what I would say one of the most fascinating judges in the entire book. Mostly because they go to such lengths, the book, of what he accomplishes. I mean, the people, of course, had fallen, and they had fallen down into the oppression of King Eglon. King Eglon was a very gluttonous king. In fact, it's very prominently spoken to us in the book about how he was very obese, and it was due to this warrior, Ehud, who, because he was left-handed, was able to smuggle a short sword into the king's royal chambers because he had a secret message, and then drove the blade all the way into his stomach. And not to say it gross on this part, but I would suggest checking out the checking out the book of Judges to see that Ehud killed him in the most interesting location. We'll leave it at that then. Your imagination, or you can go in and check out that story. Because the next one that we're going to look to is Shamgar. Interesting enough, there is not as much known in this, but during the time that he rose during a time of Philistine uprising. The Philistines had become a very prominent, strong, powerful force. They had conquered the people. They were under their oppression. Oftentimes we do not see a very warm light when it comes to the Philistines, but Shamgar was said to have taken an ox goad. If you don't know what an ox goad is, picture in your mind a cattle prod. Now this is an ancient one, so instead of a little shocker at the end, most likely had a piece of bone, something sharp or jagged to help pop. He killed 600 Philistines with this. We have no idea if he did this all at once. We have no idea if this was something that was over time. We're just told that he killed 600 Philistines, and the Israelite people knew peace for a while. But lo and behold, that did not last. We actually had, honestly, one of my favorite judges, and this is Deborah. Deborah was not just the only female judge, but she was also a prophetess. So that means she was a spiritual religious leader that the people of Israel would go to. Leaders of tribes would go to her. She was kind of that voice with God and all of this that they would go to and seek out aid and help. And so after she was part of the whole setup with the freeing of the Israelites from King Jabin, she wrote the Song of Deborah. And while I still had some troubles finding the source behind this, but one of the things I found was that it is believed that these Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, is considered one of the oldest passages of the Bible, meaning that this is one of the oldest ones that we have found in existence. Like I said, I don't know how reputable the source is. I need to dive a little bit more into that because it does fascinate me as I kind of came across this tidbit of information. But one of the things that also comes through is that Deborah plays a much larger part in things, especially as she chases the general Sisera away from the army as they were defeated, in which we will get, because the part that Sisera plays and that Deborah plays goes a little bit more once we get to Jael, in which we'll get to this because we're focusing on the judges. We'll get to the major non-judge figures soon. But Deborah played a major figure of not just being a warrior, a diplomat, and politician in this, but she was a spiritual leader, which is not something that we see rank really high with these judges in the book. So then, of course, now we go to Gideon, and he's the most famous out of them. Like, he's the one that's most well known because he has the largest section of the book of Judges. There are more judges, more written on, because he had one of those miraculous births. When he grew up, it was one of those blessing things where essentially he was like set from birth to be able to deliver the Israelites from Midian. And it's during that time that he defeated this army with just 300 men. I mean, he sent out, looked and gathered 300 of the best men and went to prove that all things are possible with God. He took out multitudes of this. In fact, compared to his compatriots, Gideon is the only one of the judges that was offered the kingship, because the tribal leaders realized how good Gideon was, and he says, no, that's not what I'm here for. So he turns that down. Next one that we see is Tola. Hey, we're halfway there. Became the judge after the death of Abimelech. And Abimelech is actually the son of Gideon, because you would think that anyone that would be the offspring or someone that would be the children of one of the greatest judges, being Gideon, would turn out well. Well, no, it doesn't go so well. He actually ends up having a great deal of problems, in which we'll get to Abimelech in a bit. But what we see is that what we do know about Tola is that he was from the tribe of Issachar. His grandfather was a man named Dodo. He led Israel for 23 years. The Bible says that he rose to save Israel, but we don't know what from. He's one of the most vague and oftentimes what's known as a minor judge. We usually have 6 major judges and then 6 minor judges. He's considered part of that thing. Then we have Jer, who is another one of those ones that we don't know a ton about. We know that he led Israel for 22 years. His claim to fame is that he had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys and ruled 30 towns. No, seriously, that's what it says. That's it. But we do know that of those 30 towns, they're known as the towns of Jericho. So yeah, I mean, some of these minor judges, we don't really know anything. We just know that they ruled over Israel for a set period of time. Now, the one that I honestly feel the most sorry for is this guy, Jephthah. Jephthah was his household was banished. They had lost their honor. They were not looked highly upon. But he was a fantastic warrior. Like, his name was known. Like, he was one of those warrior legends that if you said his name, people were like, what? Is he here? I got my action figure. You think he'll sign it? Well, no, not like that. But no, he was well known. And finally, the Israelite tribal leaders came to him saying, we need your help. We cannot do this. And he said no. They kept coming back and forth. He kept saying no until finally he just got kind of frustrated. He got really frustrated with this constant battering, and so he decides that he will do so. And so he turns to God and makes this vow. And he says to God that if God, you deliver us victory, the first thing I see when we get home, I will sacrifice to you. So he leaves. Amazing campaign. Everything works out well, and then he goes home. Remember I said that I feel the most sorry for him? Because when he gets home, the first thing he sees is his daughter running out of the house to him. He has to sacrifice his daughter, and he tears his clothes. He is beside himself, but he cannot go against his vow. So he talks to his daughter, and she says, do what you're supposed to do. Just give me time to prepare myself. And she does that, and she eventually comes back then. Well, the next judge that we're looking at is Ibzan. He's another one of those strange ones where essentially his claim to fame here was that he had 30 daughters, 30 sons, all of whom married outside his tribe, possibly to expand his family's influence, and he judged Israel for 7 years. That's that. Then we have Elon, who was the most unknown. About all that we can gather is that he was from the tribe of Zebulun, and his name means a type of tree, either an oak or a terebinth. We're not sure which, and that's pretty much it. He's the most unknown of them all. Then we have Abdon, who is probably who is the most wealthy of judges, because about all we know about him is that he had 40 sons, 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. He led Israel for 8 years, but we know that he's the wealthiest. Then, of course, we come to... I said Gideon's the most well-known, but Samson is the most, I'd say, notorious. So, there we go. That's what we're looking at. Gideon is the most famous. Samson is the most infamous. And the reason I'm saying infamous is because he's known for not a good reason. Samson was known as the strongest person in the entire Bible, and his life purpose was to wreak havoc upon the Philistines. Samson was a Nazarite, and so that meant that he was never to have alcohol, he was never to allow to cut his hair, and he was never to mess with a dead body, with a carcass or anything. And as we know with the story, he had quite the thing for Philistine women. He met his wife, and after much nagging and much pestering, he finally told her that that if she was to cut his hair, he would lose all his things. So Delilah, who had bartered a deal with the Philistines, cut his hair. They bound him, and he eventually got captured. They gouged out his eyes, and they kept him in chains. In fact, to the point that they would showcase him because he killed so many Philistines. He grabbed the jawbone of a donkey and killed soldiers. He was well known for his strength, and so they showboated him, showing like, "Ha! We took down Israel's greatest." But over that time, his hair eventually grew. They didn't pay attention to that, and so during one of the times that was the highlight of their parties, they had him between the two pillars, and he pulled those down, killing himself along with 3,000 Philistines. So, yeah, not the greatest. But he was also narcissistic, egotistical. He was not what you'd imagine for someone being the judge or someone that was being the spokesperson for God. He's far from it. So, of course, now we look at our non-judges and key figures. One of them is Barak, who worked with Deborah to lead 10,000 men against the Canaanite commander Sisera. Sisera, who saw that his army who was losing, then fled into the hills, came upon a Canaanite woman named Jael, who offered him some more milk. He fell asleep, and during the time that he was asleep, she took a tent peg, drove it through his temple. Yay! Yeah, like I said, this is a very controversial and hard book of the Bible. I should do a sermon series on it. No. Maybe. So our next one then is about our Abimelech. This is the son of Gideon. He was not a true judge, but he was murderous leader. He essentially took over the leadership of Israel and said, "I'm the king now." Not a true king, not a true judge, but he was vile, horrible, and he led the people of Israel farther down than most others during that time. And then we have Samuel, who shows up near the end. He becomes the true prophet that borders between the book of Judges to the Kings. He's at that tail end of what brings us into the book of Kings then. Then Eli, a high priest and judge, whose story is in 1 Samuel. He's the one that recognizes the potential of who Samuel will be and what Samuel will do. But he still plays a major figure because we still hear about him into this part. So now, what does that mean for us and how we can take away our key teaching? The book of Judges, at the very epitome of things I'm going to tell you, has to do with teaching us the flawness of humanity. Even the best of us fall into that. So, of course, we have our cycle of disobedience, that repeated cycle. It sees the danger of idolatry and how that takes away and causes us to lose the focus of things. The need of true leadership, in which sometimes we need someone in a position of leadership or mentorship, in which we'll get to shortly, to be able to help guide us and direct us in the right way. It reminds us that when we fail, God's grace is unfailing. The consequences of that self-centeredness, because remember, the people, it's not anything that God did to them. They did it to themselves. It was their choice. It's the same way for us. Our shortcomings, our troubles, the things that we fall into is not because of God, but because of ourselves. And why, once more, now it goes to that importance of passing faith. What it means to be a role model, what it means to be seen as someone of God, what it means to stand as an example of what God is truly like, and for people to see that. And so that becomes our takeaway text. In those days, there were no kings in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eye. It teaches and highlights us that it is our own folly that takes us and leads us into the problems that we face. It's not God, it's not leaders, it's the choices that we make that we then see the consequences of. That leads into what is the overall conclusion of this. The ultimate message is humans disobedient leads into chaos, to messes, to troubles, times, and that highlights the need for someone to be an example for that. And unfortunately, God apparently is not enough for this. And so, of course, we see the cycle of sin, consequence, cry for God. Then we see salvation, deliverance, and then peace. Everyone did what was right in their own eye. The need for a true king. God's grace amongst rebellion. Danger of compromise. The book serves as a somber reminder of humanity's depravity. And so then that takes us into what that can be for us to connect today. I found, because ultimately what we see as that main setup is what we see as the need for mentorship. Someone that shows us the right way that we may also do the same for others. And so I found this quote from Jim Henson to be practically amazing in this. The attitude you have as a parent is what your kids will learn from more than what you tell them. They don't remember what you try to teach them. They remember what you are. It's not all about the words that you say. It's how you live. When they see you open the door for someone, that's what they learn. When they see that you push someone or have road rage and give a non-good gesture or say something inappropriate, that's what they hold on to. That's how they do it. And so the key lessons that we can get from this that bring to us today is the danger of moral relativity. How we treat people. How we interact and how we see the core failure of things. Understanding that even when we fail, God doesn't fail. We can't compromise with what's going on in the hopes of something better happening. And we need more than anything the importance of having someone that can guide us and lead us, so that in the same way we can be that guidance and leading for someone else at the same time. And so what we see through all this is that the book of Judges, more than anything, teaches us the level of human depravity. That even when we think that we're holy or that we're righteous or we feel that we follow God the best, we still screw up. We still fail. But what we gain from that failure is not to turn away from it or to ignore it, but to embrace what failure we've come across and turn it into a strength. Turn it into something more. Don't deny a part of who we are, because then that's denying who we are. Embrace it and become something more. So I hope you enjoy what we've gone through the book of Judges. This lesson was quite a bit longer than what I normally do, but that's just because a major focus and part of this is to see that we're flawed. And one of the things I'm hoping that you saw, because I did this intentional, is a number of my slides had misspellings. They had errors in there because Judges calls us to reflect on our flaws, our shortcomings, and then just to improve upon them. So don't shy away, embrace, and go further. So I hope you gained something amazing from this lesson. I always look forward to doing this stuff, and we will see you in 2 weeks when we get ready to go into our next book of the Bible. So I will see you then, and have yourself a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.